Good morning.
Good morning. It's a
I,
pleasure to be here.
well, absolutely. I'm so thrilled that in the third edition of the Fireside Chat, I have the honor and pleasure to welcome Ms. Ugochi Daniels, who is the Deputy Director General for Operations IOM, a former resident coordinator.
Yeah.
And it's fantastic to have you at COP29 at the United Nations Azerbaijan Pavilion.
And it's a great honor to be here.
Thank you so much. Today is the thematic day on food, agriculture, and water. And what we would like to hear from you, Ugo, is really how the climate change and food insecurity, as compounding drivers on human mobility and displacement, are being tackled by the important task that IOM has.
Very simple question. Okay, so let me try and break it down. And let me try and break it down. So we know that climate change impacts the ability for people to produce the food that they eat. We know that agriculture is the primary livelihood in many of the areas most impacted by climate change and populations that are most vulnerable to climate change. And we can look at it, we can take the example of drought, we can take the example of flooding. If they're not able to grow their crops, if they're not able to raise their livestock, then apart from not having the food, they don't have a livelihood, which then compounds the situation, oftentimes forcing them to move. And then you have displacement, which in and of itself then compounds the situation further. So it's a really close nexus between how climate change affects food production, distribution, accessibility, and then with displacement further complicating it. And what we see is that the impact of drought is 5 times more the impact of flooding when it comes to displacement. At the same time, we know that food insecurity is like an intermediate factor. So you might have, if we take the case, the very obvious case is Somalia. So 2 years back, there was very bad flooding that led to displacement. But this was because it had followed 3 successive years. So the coping mechanisms that people had already been used. And the displacement was was much higher the third time around. So it's a complicated dynamic of the food insecurity of livelihoods and displacement, which can often lead to a cycle of primary displacement, secondary displacement, etc.
It is a vicious cycle, and this COP29, part of the expected outcomes, and as they say here, inshallah, we'll see what will come out by the end of COP29, is really to put focus on finance and technology transfer, particularly for the most vulnerable countries and communities. But in that sense, and maybe just to be on a more positive note, and there has been a lot of discussion about mitigation and basically net zero gas emissions. However, at the same time, a lot of focus and efforts should be put into adaptation measures. And in that sense, migration and human mobility can be actually a positive adaptation measure. Your thoughts on this?
Okay, so I'm sure many of you would have heard the terminology, the migration crisis, right? As if migration is a bad thing. What we say as IOM is that it's a very positive adaptation strategy, because if we look at certain geographies, the impact of climate, we know, is so much that they're not going to be able to adapt with new technologies or new agricultural practices. And therefore, in such situations, migration gives them a positive coping strategy if it is well planned, regular, orderly, dignified. So if you look at the agreement between the government of Australia and the government of Tuvalu, where every year, I think it's about 2.5% of the population are given visas to migrate to Australia because we know what the impact of climate change is going to be on Tuvalu, right? And many countries that IOM supports, because they know that the impact of climate in those communities or in those countries is so extreme, the countries work on planned relocation of the populations that are in these extremely vulnerable settings, right? So planned relocation, planned evacuations, all of these are positive strategies to deal with the extreme to deal with the impact of extreme weather events. Let's also recognize that right now around the world, migrants send remittances home. And if you look at formal and informal, it's $1 trillion a year. And this is 3 times more than overseas development assistance and foreign direct investments, right? And interestingly, at COP last year, when I met with the diaspora, what they said to me is that, look, we are the ones that are funding loss and damage right now because it's our money that comes in first. It's our money that is going straight to the individuals. So migration is supporting recovery. It's supporting resilience because it's the remittances migrants are sending to their countries and communities of origin that is supporting recovery in these settings. So let's look at how migration, let's flip the narrative and really look at the facts and how it's remittances that are not only enabling communities to recover, but it's remittances that are investments in education, in food and health, the SDGs. And that's why we were extremely pleased when member states recognized in the Pact for the Future that was recently passed at the last UNGA, the role that migrants and the contribution migrants play in the development of their countries.
Ugo, thank you so much. And thank you for highlighting at this very end the positive role on people on the move and migrants when it comes not just to climate action, but the overall Agenda 2030. And thank you once again for joining us.
No, it was such a pleasure to be here. I didn't know it'd be over so quick.
Oh, well, we can talk more. The idea was fireside, 10 minutes max, but we can open for questions.
Absolutely.
And we do one hand raise. So
And another one here.
yes. So we'll start with Maria Jose. Both for...
And before Maria asked the question, Maria and I both became resident coordinators at the same time. So we're very close friends as well.
It's a good question for both of you because when we discuss climate and human mobility, I think and people, I think I like to hear you about the impact on women because I know it's an issue that both of you are being working. So what is your take on that? Would you like to go first or what?
I can, and I can talk about, women and girls forever. So what we see, right, is that it's women who are primarily involved in subsistence agriculture. It's women who are then most impacted because not only are they undertaking subsistence agriculture, but then they're also having to provide for their for their families. And what the data is also showing is that they are the ones that also have the solutions, the local and innovative technologies for how to respond to the impact of climate. However, they are often categorized as the vulnerable groups and not recognized as the resource for where the solutions come from. So certainly for IOM, we are prioritizing the engagement of women and girls for solutions in their communities. And if I go back to the point about remittances, there are about 1 billion remittance recipients around the world. They are predominantly women. And as we know, women make better investments than men. And we have seen at the community level that they're the ones investing in food, in health, in education, and that household savings have gone up. And therefore, a really strong focus on community level financing mechanisms that they can invest their the disposable income from the remittances after the family investments has the opportunity to be transformative in how we are supporting women in vulnerable communities, and something that I'm particularly interested in, and we've been having discussions with UNCCD, that's the Convention to Combat Desertification, is carbon offsets for rural women in vulnerable communities so that they adopt climate resilience, agricultural practices. This is where we see that transformation can really happen. So yes, they bear the burden. Yes, they are the most vulnerable, but they are the key for the transformation to the solutions to address this.
But nothing really more to add because this was eloquently put, but just to emphasize, it's not only women, it's girls as well. Because in the family, they, in a way, share the burden of responsibilities with their mothers when they're left at home and not necessarily will have access to education and funding. And what Ugo has just explained, it's a number of initiatives that obviously the global level are put forward, but in Azerbaijan as well. We have another question, and I will put the mic forward.
Thank you very much. So I'm Güler from the UN Arts Office in Azerbaijan. First, thank you very much for highlighting the positive role migrants are playing, but not only sending the remittances to their countries, communities, but also to the economy of the host communities. But as you know, there is a lot of hatred and racism around the migrant populations, and it is used as a tool for political populism. Specifically in the European countries. And I know that IOM is doing a lot to support the migrants themselves and their families, but are there any initiatives to change the discourse around the migrants, especially in politics? Thank you.
So thank you for asking the question. It's a great question and really speaks to the context and trends we're seeing today. So let me first of all start off with the data from the World Economic Forum Global Threat Risk Index. And it ranks the top 10 threats that the world faces. And you would think climate change would be number one. Climate change is number two. The number one threat is disinformation and misinformation. And obviously, one of the key areas for misinformation and disinformation has been migration. So as IOM, there are a whole range of things that we do. But first of all, starting off with the data and the evidence, right? So if you take Europe as an example, 2023, the ICMPD report that did an analysis in preparation for the EU Pact on Migration that was adopted there were 700 million entries into Europe. 700 million. And of course, these are people, it includes people coming and going, but Europe had 700 million entries. Of the 700 million, it was around 350,000 that were irregular, right? So let's just put this into context that yes, we want to stop irregular. Well, we want to better manage migration so that people don't have to put their lives in the hand of a trafficker or a smuggler. But when you compare regular migration with irregular migration far, far, far exceeds irregular and the contributions migrants are making. If you look at Portugal, migrants contribute $1 billion every year to the Social Security scheme. Around the world, migrants make up 3% of the global population, but 10% of global GDP. So we really need to talk about the positive contributions that migrants are making. That's one. Number two, when it comes to better managing migration and dealing with irregular migration, we see a reaction by governments to say it's all about border security. There is no data that shows with one policy response to tighten your border that it reduces irregular migration. In fact, it makes it more hidden, more dangerous, and people are more vulnerable, right? And that's why at IOM we talk about expanding regular pathways for labor mobility so that people who are seeking better economic opportunities don't have to put their hands in the hands of a trafficker to get to a border and claim asylum. They're claiming asylum because that's the only route that's available. And we have seen that over the past decade, 2 decades, that there are pathways between developed and highly developed countries between each other, and that pathways from developing countries are actually shrinking, right? So when you don't have opportunities to move regularly, they will go irregularly, right? And because they're all claiming asylum, and the asylum system, which was put in place after World War II, the world is in a very different place now. And so the asylum system is overburdened, and it gives the impression to citizens that governments aren't managing migration well, the borders are being stormed, all of these people are going to come and invade our countries, right? It's a very negative narrative when the reality is actually the opposite. There is no country right now that's not in need of migrants. If you look at, or developed country, if you look at the top 30 OECD economies right now, there are 30 million vacant jobs, costing them over $1 trillion a year. So if there's 30 million vacant jobs, you're going to need migrants to address this. So yes, it's important to protect your borders, but it's also important to have a comprehensive approach to how migration is being managed, because what I always say, whatever we don't do, meaning the good guys, all of us, we consider ourselves the good guys, for ensuring migration is safe, dignified, and regular, the traffickers are going to do. And that's what we are seeing. The trafficking industry is booming because people see this as their only option, and misinformation and disinformation is creating this feeling or perception or misperception that countries are being invaded by irregular migrants. And then my final point on this is, if you look at COVID, there would have been no COVID recovery if it hadn't been for migrants. Look at any countries, how they have recovered from COVID. There has been a key role migrants have played as frontline workers, as healthcare workers, as truck drivers, elder care workers for the recovery of COVID, and also to the economic recovery in different sectors in the economies. But we still see these significant gaps, the 30 million. And then my final point on this, since we're here at COP and talking about the just transition and the green transition, right now, in the green economy, there are 7 million vacant jobs. The green transition, just transition, is not going to be achieved without the contribution of migration, right? So we have to, certainly we do it as IOM, but we have to always be not just countering the narrative with the data, but offering the solutions of what we know works for good migration governance. And that's why we have the Global Compact on Migration with its 23 objectives that covers all aspects required for good migration governance and cooperation between countries.
Sure. Can you hear me? Okay. Hello, and firstly, thank you for joining us. That's been really insightful. I have two questions, but I think very short. One is on climate migration. It's been, I know, a bit of a tough term to define because often climate is an indirect driver. So I was wondering if IOM has an approach to defining climate migration, or if that's the wrong question. And the second question was, you mentioned that sometimes communities have coping mechanisms which can be strengthened to deal with climate risks, but that in other cases the best solution is planned migration and regular, dignified, rather than strengthening resilience. I was wondering if there are tools to assess what is the best situation. I think in Tuvalu maybe it's pretty clear, but maybe there are some situations where it's more difficult to assess. So I was wondering how IOM goes about that. Thank you.
So I'll take the last question first. So the World Bank data is that by 2050, 216 million people will be displaced in their countries due to the impact of climate. 80% of that can be prevented with investments in resilience, right? So we already know where we need to be investing to support people to stay where they are. And when we talk about climate resilience, it's all about sustainable livelihood, sustainable agriculture. And there's a lot of evidence on what the solutions are for the different contexts, right? So, and at the same time, we also know the cases where, so Tuvalu and small island developing states is one context, but we also have countries where rapid desertification, for example, right? And we know that their environments are changing. If we don't support them to adapt now, then it ends up being that they will have to move, right? So we want to be able to identify, certainly for IOM, we focus on the most vulnerable communities so that it doesn't get to the stage where the impact is so extreme they can no longer adapt, okay? And then on climate migration, first of all, there isn't even a globally agreed definition on migration to start off with. And you're very right that the factors, it's not easy to easily identify that this person moved because of climate, right? Because if you go back to the example I gave for Somalia, they had a flood, but they had coping mechanisms, so they didn't move. But after 3 successive years, that same flood will trigger displacement. So it's often a complex interplay of factors. So as IOM, what we're focusing on is who is most at risk for displacement, and what are the coping mechanisms that they have, and where are they with those coping mechanisms. So if we identify communities that are already food insecure, right, it's therefore a much higher likelihood that if there is an extreme weather event, they're at higher risk, even if it's the same event across a whole country. But the communities that are already food insecure, their likelihood of displacement is much higher. And so we focus on the vulnerable communities to enable them to stay. But we recognize, even with all the investment, some are going to move. And what we often see is they move to cities. So we do a lot of work with cities to support them in their planning for the growth in population that they're going to see. In any case, countries are rapidly urbanizing, so that rural-urban migration is already happening. With the impact of climate, there's an additional, caseload that's migrating as well. And therefore, it's really important to support cities. I think the message I would like to leave you with is that migration has shaped human civilization. People will always be on the move. That is just the reality. Saying that it is going to stop is not realistic. So how do we support governments? How do we support communities? How we support migrants? That when they move, it's out of choice, it's safe, regular, and dignified. And what is the global cooperation frameworks that are needed? Because by definition, migration doesn't respect borders, right? People are going to move to where they can find the opportunity, and therefore international cooperation is such an important part of the work that we do.
Ugo,
I'm
thank
just
you
warming
so
up.
much. Oh, no, this was fantastic. It was planned to be 10 minutes. We went beyond. I think it was really, really insightful. And at the end of the day, I do hope that COP29 will bring up some positive outcomes for the people on the move, for the planet, and ultimately, I think it is a shared responsibility. There is no one individual, there is no one organization that can tackle these issues. And IOM, as part of the larger UN development system, plays a very important role. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much. It was my pleasure.